15 years. 15 years of flashing lights and relentless sirens, of the constant pressure to be a lifeline in someone's darkest hour. 15 years of holding hands clammy with fear, of the acrid smell of burnt rubber and spilled gasoline, of the hollow echo of screams against the backdrop of urban decay. 15 years as an EMT had etched lines onto my face that mirrored the stress lines of the city itself. My nights were haunted by phantom sirens, my days punctuated by the lingering scent of antiseptic and adrenaline. Not just out of the job, though early retirement was a blessing I wouldn't refuse, but out of the incessant cacophony that had become the soundtrack to my life. I craved the quiet, the deep, soul-sustaining silence that the city had long since swallowed whole. I yearned for the rustling of leaves, the chirping of crickets, the gentle hush of the wind whispering through the trees, sounds that had faded into a distant memory, almost mythical in their simplicity. The dream had become an obsession, a burning need to escape the concrete jungle and find a sanctuary where I could finally hear myself think, where the only emergencies were those I chose to acknowledge, my meager belongings, and traded the concrete canyons for a patch of green in a quiet suburban neighborhood miles away from the nearest hospital. The house itself was unassuming, a modest 2-story with a sprawling, overgrown yard that promised hours of therapeutic labor. The previous owners, an elderly couple who had moved into assisted living, had left behind a sense of peaceful stagnation, a feeling that time had slowed down within its walls. I could almost taste the tranquility, the promise of a life lived at a different pace. The realtor, a woman with a practiced smile and a penchant for exaggeration, had described the neighborhood as idyllic, a haven of peace and quiet. I chose to believe her, ignoring the nagging voice of cynicism that had become a constant companion during my years on the force. I wanted to believe in the possibility of normalcy, of a life where the most pressing issue was the height of the grass or the color of the mailbox. The closing went smoothly, the keys exchanged, and I stood on the porch, breathing in the fresh, albeit slightly polluted air. My dog, a rescue mutt named Shadow, who had seen me through countless sleepless nights, sniffed excitedly at the unfamiliar scents, his tail wagging with uncharacteristic enthusiasm. He, too, seemed to sense the change, the promise of a calmer existence. The first few days were bliss. I spent my time unpacking, cleaning, and exploring the neighborhood on foot. The neighbors I encountered were polite, if a little reserved, offering tentative smiles and brief nods. The loudest sound was the distant hum of lawnmowers, a far cry from the ear-splitting wail of sirens. I started to feel the tension ease from my shoulders, the knot in my stomach slowly unraveling. I could sit on the porch in the evening, sipping a cold drink and listening to the crickets chirp, feeling a sense of contentment I hadn't experienced in years. This was it, I thought. This was the peace I had been searching for. This was the sanctuary I had desperately needed. The illusion of tranquility, however, was short-lived. Like a storm cloud gathering on the horizon, a disruption was brewing, harbinger of discord that threatened to shatter the fragile peace I had so painstakingly constructed. Her name was Karen, a name that had, even before I met her, become synonymous with a particular type of entitled, self-righteous busybody. And, to add insult to injury, it was actually her real name. She lived 2 houses down, a veritable sentinel of suburban conformity, her property a testament to the aesthetic dictates of the homeowners association. Her lawn was meticulously manicured, adorned with a collection of lawn ornaments that seemed to multiply overnight: plastic flamingos, ceramic gnomes, and a ludicrously large spinning pinwheel that caught the sunlight with blinding intensity. But it wasn't the gaudy display that bothered me. It was the woman herself. Her perpetually pursed lips and the judgmental glint in her eyes that hinted at a simmering discontentment. From the moment I moved in, I could feel her scrutiny, her silent assessment of my worthiness to reside in her pristine neighborhood. The first interaction was seemingly innocuous. As I was unloading boxes from my truck, she approached her arms crossed tightly across her chest, a disapproving frown etched on her face. "That driveway," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's far too wide for this neighborhood. It disrupts the flow of the street. I stared at her, dumbfounded. The driveway had been there for decades, predating her arrival, and it certainly wasn't impacting the flow of traffic. "It's the original driveway," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "I haven't changed anything," she scoffed. "Original or not, it's an eyesore. You should consider narrowing it." I politely declined, turning my attention back to the boxes. But that was just the beginning. Next, it was the color of my shutters. They were a deep shade of charcoal gray, a color I found modern and understated. Karen, however, deemed them to urban, a jarring contrast to the pastel hues that dominated the street. "This isn't some hipster loft in the city," she declared, her voice sharp and accusatory. "This is a respectable neighborhood, and your shutters are bringing down property values." I tried to ignore her, chalking it up to garden variety neighborhood eccentricity. But her comments were relentless, a constant barrage of petty grievances that chipped away at my resolve. I felt myself becoming increasingly agitated, the peace I had worked so hard to achieve slowly eroding under the weight of her relentless criticism. Shadow, sensing my unease, would growl softly whenever she approached, a warning sign that I should have heeded more closely. The tension between us was palpable, a silent battle of wills waged across manicured lawns and perfectly symmetrical hedges. I knew it was only a matter of time before the storm that had been brewing finally broke. The storm finally erupted over the issue of the fence. I had decided to install a black aluminum fence around my yard for a few simple reasons. Privacy for shadow, a deterrent for the occasional stranger who seemed to think my property was a public thoroughfare, frankly a visual barrier between myself and Karen's ever-watchful gaze. I hired a local crew known for their efficiency and professionalism. The permit was secured, the property lines clearly marked, and the installation began without a hitch. The clean black aluminum was sleek and modern, blending seamlessly with the landscape without being ostentatious. It was exactly what I wanted. A simple, functional barrier that would afford me a modicum of peace and privacy. The installation was halfway complete when Karen descended upon my property like a wrathful deity. Her socks and flip-flops combo a clear indication of the urgency of her mission. She was yelling before she even set foot on my grass, her face contorted with outrage. "What do you think you're doing?" she shrieked, her voice shrill enough to shatter glass. "That monstrosity is ruining the entire neighborhood." I sighed, bracing myself for another round of her relentless tirade. "It's a fence, Karen," I said, trying to remain calm. "I have a permit, and it's entirely within my property lines." She waved her hand dismissively. "Permit or no permit, it's an abomination. It's changing the entire character of the neighborhood. No one around here has a fence like that." She then launched into a familiar litany of complaints how it was lowering property values, how it was an eyesore, how it was disrupting the harmonious aesthetic of the street. I tuned her out, focusing on the rhythmic clang of the fence posts being driven into the ground. I had dealt with far worse during my years as an EMT. A ranting entitled neighbor was hardly a crisis. But then she said something that made me stop in my tracks. "It's an intimidation tactic. That's what it is," she exclaimed, her eyes narrowing. "You're trying to intimidate us, your neighbors? You're trying to wall yourself off from the community?" I couldn't help but laugh. "Intimidate? You, Karen. I just want some privacy. I want to be able to let my dog run around without worrying about him getting hit by a car. I want to be able to sit in my backyard without feeling like I'm being constantly watched." She wasn't listening. She was too caught up in her own self-righteous indignation, her own distorted perception of reality. I turned and walked away, determined to ignore her and let the fence crew finish their work. But then I heard her voice again, this time on the phone. And what she said next made my blood run cold. 911. "What's your emergency?" The disembodied voice of the dispatcher was a familiar one, a sound that had been a constant presence in my life for 15 years. But this time it was different. This time I wasn't on the other end of the line, desperately trying to get help to someone in need. This time, I was the subject of the emergency, the perceived threat that warranted the intervention of law enforcement. I stood frozen, eavesdropping on Karen's twisted narrative, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my stomach. "There's a suspicious man building a barrier around a property," she said, her voice trembling with feigned alarm. Yes, I think he's trying to trap someone in there. Trap someone? The absurdity of the accusation was almost comical. The fence was designed to keep people out, not in. Was meant to provide privacy, not to create a prison. But Karen's words hung in the air, thick with malice and manipulation. She proceeded to describe me, painting a picture of a menacing figure erecting a fortress of oppression. She left out the part where it was my property, my land, my legal right to build a fence. She conveniently omitted the fact that I had obtained the necessary permits and followed all the proper procedures. Instead, she portrayed me as a dangerous outsider, a threat to the safety and security of her idyllic neighborhood. "He doesn't belong here," she hissed into the phone, her voice dripping with prejudice. "I don't think he belongs on this street. He's changing everything." The dispatcher, trained to handle all manner of emergencies, remained calm and professional, asking pertinent questions and gathering information. But I knew that Karen's words were having an effect, planting seeds of doubt and suspicion in the dispatcher's mind. I could almost hear the gears turning, the internal calculations being made, as the dispatcher assessed the situation and determined the appropriate response. And then the sirens. Distant at first, a faint wail in the background, but growing. Louder with each passing second, a crescendo of impending doom. My heart pounded in my chest, my hands clammy with sweat. This was it, I thought. This was the moment when my carefully constructed peace would be shattered, when my sanctuary would be invaded by the very forces I had spent years trying to escape. The sirens grew louder, closer, until they were deafening, filling the air with a cacophony of noise that echoed the chaos and trauma of my past life. 3 police cars screeched to a halt in front of my house, their lights flashing, casting an eerie glow on the manicured lawns and pristine facades of the unsuspecting neighborhood. One officer even had his hand near his holster, his eyes scanning the scene with a mixture of suspicion and caution. Karen, emboldened by the arrival of law enforcement, stood on her lawn, arms crossed triumphantly across her chest, smug look on her face. The storm had finally broken, and I was standing directly in its path. Despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins, I forced myself to remain calm. Years of responding to emergencies had taught me the importance of composure, of maintaining a clear head in the face of chaos. I knew that the situation could quickly escalate if I reacted defensively or aggressively. Instead, I decided to cooperate fully with the officers, to provide them with all the information they needed to assess the situation objectively. As the officers approached, their faces grim and unreadable, I held up my hands in a gesture of "Surrender, officers," I said, my voice steady and controlled. "I understand there's been a complaint about the fence. I have all the necessary permits and documentation to prove that the installation is legal." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my driver's license, my proof of residency, and the building permit for the fence. I presented them to the officer in charge, a stern-faced man with a weathered complexion and a no-nonsense demeanor. He examined the documents carefully, his eyes scanning each line, each signature, each official seal. Meanwhile, Karen continued to rant from across the lawn, her voice growing more shrill and hysterical with each passing moment. She accused me of zoning violations, of disrupting the peace, of constructing domestic terror architecture. Her words were absurd and illogical, but they were clearly designed to incite the officers to sway their opinion in her favor. I ignored her, focusing on the officer in front of me. I answered his questions calmly and truthfully, explaining my reasons for building the fence and reiterating my commitment to complying with all local regulations. The officer listened patiently, his expression betraying nothing. He then turned his attention to Karen, walking over to her sidewalk to hear her side of the story. She launched into a lengthy and convoluted explanation, repeating her accusations and embellishing them with outlandish claims. As I watched, I noticed one of the officers, a younger man with a thoughtful expression, began to look more closely at Karen. He seemed to recognize her, something in her demeanor or her words triggering a memory. He asked her to step aside, away from the other officers and me, and began to engage her in a separate conversation. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could see the officer's expression growing increasingly serious. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through something, his brow furrowed in concentration. And then, the real twist. The officer, whose name I later learned was Officer Lane, approached me with a look of quiet understanding. "Sir," he said, his voice low and apologetic. "I think we have a better understanding of the situation now." He explained that he recognized Karen from another incident a few months back, in a different part of town. She had made a false report about a Latino family's barbecue, claiming it was a gang rally and that they were disturbing the peace. Officer Lane had pulled up the report on his phone, confirming his suspicions. "You're not the first person. She's targeted," he said, shaking his head in dismay. Curiosity piqued. I decided to let the fence crew continue their work and walked over to the sidewalk where Karen was still ranting, albeit with less conviction than before. It was then, as if orchestrated for comedic effect, an old beat-up SUV pulled up to the curb. A man emerged, looking weary but determined. He introduced himself as Malik, a former neighbor of Karen's from 2 counties over, explained that Officer Lane had contacted him earlier that day after running Karen's name through the system. Malik proceeded to recount a litany of similar incidents, detailing how Karen had harassed him and his family with racist remarks, filed false complaints with the homeowners association, and even made false 911 calls. He had brought evidence, pictures, recordings, and even screenshots of inflammatory posts she had made on a neighborhood app under a burner account. The officers huddled together, their expressions grave as they listened to Malik's testimony and examined the evidence he had presented. Karen, visibly shaken, suddenly lost her voice, her earlier bravado replaced with a nervous silence. The officers asked her a few more questions, but she was no longer the confident, self-righteous busybody she had been just moments before. Finally, the moment arrived. Officer Lane walked back up my driveway, his face etched with a mixture of apology and relief. "Sir," he said, extending his hand. "You're good to go. Sorry for the inconvenience." He then turned to Karen and informed her that she would be receiving a citation for filing a false police report. I don't know what ultimately became of her after that day. I heard rumors that she was facing additional charges related to her past behavior, but I didn't dwell on it. Focus was on reclaiming the peace I had so desperately sought. The neighborhood, however, underwent a noticeable transformation. People started waving at me more frequently, their smiles genuine and welcoming. One neighbor even brought me a casserole the next day, a gesture of goodwill and solidarity. Word travels fast in a small community, and it was clear that Karen's reputation had been irrevocably tarnished. The fence, finally completed, stood smooth, strong, and 6 feet tall. It served as a physical barrier, delineating my property lines and providing the privacy I craved. But more than that, it became a symbol of my resilience, a testament to my ability to overcome adversity and to protect my peace. It was funny, I thought, how the only thing it really ended up protecting me from was her. I could finally sit on my porch in the evening, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, the chirping of crickets, and the gentle hum of the suburban night. The sirens of the city, the echoes of trauma, had finally faded into the background, replaced by the soothing sounds of sanctuary. The peace I had bought the house for had finally arrived, not despite the chaos, but because of it.